In a quiet suburban neighborhood filled with neatly trimmed lawns and cheerful flower beds, Karen took her role as the self-appointed watchdog of community rules very seriously. With her clipboard in hand, she patrolled the streets like a hawk, always on the lookout for any infractions that might disturb the HOA harmony she cherished. Karen knew every rule in the Homeowners Association guidelines and prided herself on upholding them. Her neighbors often joked about her obsession, but they also appreciated how she kept the community in check. To Karen, a well-maintained neighborhood represented peace and order, and she was determined to protect it at all costs. Life in the neighborhood had always been predictable, until the Johnson family moved in next door. Their teenage son, Jake, was carefree and often parked his bright red car right in front of Karen's house. It didn't take long for Karen's irritation to grow. She saw this as a blatant disregard for community standards and felt it threatened the harmony she worked so hard to maintain. Little did she know that her next move would spiral into a much bigger conflict than she ever anticipated. As the days passed, the Johnson family settled into their new home, and Karen couldn't help but notice their teenage son, Jake. He was full of energy and often drove his bright red car around the neighborhood, a stark contrast to the quiet routine Karen had cherished. At first, she thought little of it, but soon enough, Jake's car began to appear more frequently parked right in front of her house. Karen observed this with growing annoyance. Each time she glanced out her window, there it was, a shiny red reminder of what she saw as a blatant disregard for the community's standards. It felt as if Jake was challenging her authority as the neighborhood rule enforcer. She wondered why he couldn't park in front of his own home or at least find another spot that wouldn't disrupt her view. The sight of the car became an obsession for Karen. She began counting how many times it appeared each week and imagining all the ways she could confront him about it. Her mind raced with thoughts of HOA regulations and how she could protect her idea of harmony in the neighborhood. Little did she know, her annoyance was just the beginning of a much larger issue brewing just outside her front door. As the weeks rolled by, Karen's frustration with Jake's parking habits intensified. She couldn't shake the feeling that it was more than just a car parked in front of her house. To her, it symbolized a threat to the peace she worked so hard to maintain in the neighborhood. Every time she looked at that shiny red car, it felt like an invasion of her space and authority. Karen began to overanalyze every aspect of the situation. What kind of example is he setting for other kids, she thought, imagining a cascade of teenage cars taking over the streets. She started writing notes to herself about how important it was to uphold community standards, convinced that if no one pointed out the issue, more neighbors would follow suit and start disregarding the HOA rules. Conversations with her friends only fueled her fire. They agreed that Jake's behavior was disrespectful, making Karen feel justified in her growing anger. In her mind, she imagined all sorts of consequences if this trend continued. It became clear that Karen had convinced herself this was not just a personal annoyance but a matter of principle. And soon enough, she resolved to take matters into her own hands, unaware of how far this could spiral out of control. Determined to take control of the situation, Karen sat at her kitchen table one afternoon with a notepad in front of her. She scribbled down various ideas, trying to craft a rule that would justify her annoyance. After some thought, she came up with a dubious street parking regulation that she imagined existed, a rule stating that no cars could park in front of someone else's house if it was not related to the homeowner. In her mind, this was logical and would restore harmony to her beloved neighborhood. Feeling empowered by her own creativity, Karen envisioned how she'd present this rule to Jake. She would frame it as her duty to uphold community standards, making it clear that he was being inconsiderate. The thought of confronting him filled her with both excitement and anxiety. She believed that this action would affirm her position as the neighborhood authority and require respect from everyone. With her fictitious rule in hand, Karen felt a sense of purpose wash over her. She pictured Jake's surprise and embarrassment as he realized he had been breaking an imaginary guideline. Little did she know that this attempt at enforcement would quickly backfire, setting off a chain reaction that neither she nor the neighborhood could anticipate. With her imaginary rule firmly in mind, Karen felt a surge of determination as she prepared to confront Jake. One sunny afternoon, she saw him outside, casually leaning against his bright red car and chatting with a couple of friends. This was her moment. With a deep breath, she marched over, her clipboard clutched tightly in her hand, feeling more confident than ever. "Excuse me, Jake," she called out, stopping a few feet away. The teenagers glanced at her, surprised by her sudden approach. Karen tried to maintain a stern expression as she explained her regulation. With a flourish, she handed him the fake citation she had created, detailing what she claimed were the consequences of violating her imagined street parking rule. Jake looked confused and slightly amused as he read the citation. He glanced at his friends, who stifled giggles at the absurdity of it all. Rather than reacting with embarrassment or compliance as Karen had hoped, Jake responded with laughter and shrugged it off. "Is this real?" he asked, still chuckling, while Karen stood there fuming inside. Little did she know that this interaction would set off a series of events that would escalate beyond her control. Jake stood in disbelief as he finished reading the citation Karen had given him. He exchanged glances with his friends, who were still giggling at the unexpected encounter. Not understanding how anyone could take such a rule seriously, Jake decided to go home and show the citation to his parents. He knew they would find it just as absurd as he did. When he entered the house, Jake waved the citation in the air, calling for his mom and dad. "You won't believe what just happened," he exclaimed, unable to contain his laughter. His parents approached, curious about the commotion, and Jake explained how Karen had confronted him over a fake rule about street parking. His parents shared a puzzled look. They listened intently as Jake recounted the whole story, starting from the moment they moved in and how Karen had acted since day one. As they processed this information, Jake's father frowned and folded his arms. "This sounds serious. I think we should talk to the city about it," he said, feeling that Karen's behavior warranted attention. Little did everyone know that this decision would lead them down a path of conflict that would eventually involve not only the Johnson family but also city officials and the HOA itself. The following day, Jake's father picked up the phone to call the city's planning department. He wanted clarity on the rules regarding street parking and whether Karen had any legitimate grounds for her citation. After a brief conversation, a city official agreed to come by and discuss the situation in person. Later that week, a friendly city official arrived at the Johnsons' home. As he introduced himself, Jake, his parents, and even some curious neighbors gathered to hear what he had to say. The official explained that street parking was indeed public property and confirmed that neither the HOA nor any individual could regulate it. He emphasized that as long as vehicles were legally parked and not violating any traffic laws, residents had every right to park in front of their own homes, or anyone else's for that matter. Relieved by this clarification, Jake's parents felt empowered to stand up against Karen's antics. They thanked the official for his visit, and he left with a smile, hoping their neighborhood would embrace harmony rather than conflict. Little did they know that this newfound knowledge would soon lead to a confrontation with Karen that would escalate in ways none of them could anticipate. After the city official left, the Johnson family felt a sense of victory, but Karen was in turmoil. Word quickly spread through the neighborhood about the official's visit and his confirmation that the HOA had no authority over street parking. Karen, once seen as the enforcer of neighborhood rules, found herself questioning her position and reputation. As she learned about the city's ruling, embarrassment washed over her. She couldn't fathom that her made-up citation was not only baseless but had sparked such a commotion. For days, she had convinced herself that Jake was violating an imaginary rule. Now, that facade crumbled before her eyes. Karen began to hear whispers among her neighbors, some discussing how they never agreed with her strict interpretations of HOA guidelines. Now recognized as a figure of ridicule rather than authority, Karen's frustration boiled over. She resolved to confront the Johnsons directly but felt conflicted. Would they see her as a nuisance or as someone desperately trying to restore order? Unsure of how to regain her influence in the community, she plotted her next move, one that might only dig her deeper into conflict. With the city's confirmation still ringing in her ears, Karen watched helplessly as Jake continued to park his car right in front of her house. Each day, the bright red vehicle seemed to taunt her from the curb, a symbol of her failure to uphold what she believed were essential neighborhood standards. After the humiliation of her false citation, she had hoped that knowing the truth would deter Jake from parking there, but instead, it emboldened him. The sight of his car became increasingly infuriating. She couldn't fathom how he could act so carelessly in front of someone who had always valued order and community rules. Each time Karen saw Jake jump out of his car and dash into his house with a smile, it felt like a personal victory for him, a defeat that cut deeper with every episode. Her mind raced with thoughts of retaliation. How can I make him understand, she asked herself, convinced that somehow he needed to be taught a lesson about respect. The fact that there were no repercussions only fueled her anger further, and soon Karen found herself devising new plans to regain control, plans that might lead to even greater conflict. Determined to regain her sense of control, Karen decided to ramp up her complaints about Jake and his family. She began documenting every little thing she could perceive as a violation, from noise levels during their summer barbecues to instances when she believed Jake's friends parked too close to her lawn. In her mind, these small details were additional evidence of their disregard for the neighborhood's harmony. As she gathered her evidence, Karen made her way back to the HOA board with a stack of papers detailing all the supposed infractions. She felt a strange mix of nervousness and excitement as she prepared to present her case. Maybe this time, they would support her in addressing what she saw as an ongoing issue with the Johnsons. However, instead of finding allies within the HOA, Karen's persistent complaints began to raise eyebrows among board members. They started questioning whether she was focusing too much on the Johnsons rather than promoting community spirit. This pivotal moment left Karen feeling increasingly isolated as whispers of concern about her obsession began circulating among neighbors. Unfazed, and underestimating the situation's consequences, Karen doubled down on her efforts, convinced that she was still in the right and that she would eventually emerge victorious. As Karen's complaints escalated, the other neighbors began to notice her increasingly erratic behavior. Conversations shifted from friendly greetings to hushed discussions about her obsessive focus on the Johnson family. Many felt uneasy watching her go through their neighborhood with a clipboard, documenting what she believed were violations of community standards. At a weekend barbecue, a few concerned residents gathered to share their thoughts. "Have you noticed how fixated she is on them?" one neighbor remarked, shaking her head. "It's like she's lost sight of what really matters in our community." Others agreed, expressing worry that Karen's actions were creating an atmosphere of tension rather than unity. As whispers spread, some residents began to distance themselves from Karen, feeling uncomfortable with how far she would go to assert her authority. They questioned whether this was about neighborhood harmony or if she was merely trying to control others. Meanwhile, Karen remained oblivious to the growing discontent among her neighbors, convinced that they would come around once they saw the truth about the Johnsons. However, as her reputation suffered, the possibility of community support dwindled, leaving her isolated and desperate for validation in her misguided crusade. As Karen's behavior escalated, more and more neighbors began to voice their concerns about her treatment of the Johnson family. Complaints soon reached the city officials, who were already aware of her previous harassment warning. The influx of reports prompted them to take the matter seriously, leading to a decision to investigate her actions further. City officials arranged for meetings with residents to gather testimonies about Karen's conduct. They heard tales of how she frequently monitored Jake and his friends, documenting their activities, and how she had made a series of unfounded complaints that only seemed to stem from her obsession with maintaining control over the neighborhood. As the investigation unfolded, it became clearer that her actions were creating a hostile environment rather than fostering the harmony she claimed to protect. Officials recognized that Karen's behavior was not just an annoyance, it had become a potential violation of community peace. Feeling the pressure mounting, Karen remained in denial, convinced she was still right in her efforts to maintain order. However, as the city's scrutiny intensified, she faced the unsettling reality that she could soon be facing more serious consequences for her harassment, not just from the city, but from the very community she once believed she was safeguarding. The day finally arrived when city officials delivered the formal warning to Karen. She sat across from them, her heart racing as they explained that her behavior had crossed the line into harassment. The words felt surreal. She had always believed herself to be the vigilant protector of neighborhood harmony. Now, she realized that her efforts to enforce community rules had completely backfired. As she stared at the warning letter outlining their observations and complaints, a wave of humiliation washed over her. Her actions had not only alienated the Johnson family but had also turned her into a figure of scorn among her neighbors. The realization struck her that her quest for control had generated more conflict rather than resolving it. She had been so consumed by her personal grievances that she had lost sight of the sense of community she once valued. Feeling overwhelmed, Karen began to question her own motives. How had it come to this? Instead of being respected as the neighborhood enforcer, she was now viewed as a nuisance. The warning felt like a cold slap of reality, forcing Karen to confront the extent of her obsession and the necessity of changing her ways, or facing even greater consequences from those around her. As Karen reflected on the chaotic events that had unfolded, she began to recognize how her overwhelming need for control had dramatically altered her relationships within the neighborhood. In her pursuit of enforcing what she believed were necessary community standards, she had unwittingly alienated the very people she intended to protect and engage. The Johnson family, once just new neighbors, became her adversaries, and her relentless complaints pushed others away, fostering distrust and discomfort among the residents. Karen realized too late that her actions, which she viewed as noble efforts to maintain order, had instead created a toxic atmosphere of tension and hostility. Her obsession had blinded her to the importance of open communication and camaraderie with her neighbors, essential elements of community spirit. Now, she stood alone, facing the consequences of her behavior, grappling with the social isolation that resulted from her misguided crusade. The formal warning felt like a pivotal moment of reckoning. It forced Karen to confront how deeply her need for control affected not only her own life but also the lives of others around her. The unintended consequences of her actions served as a hard lesson in humility, making her question what kind of neighbor, and person, she truly wanted to be moving forward. In reflecting on her tumultuous journey, Karen comes to understand the vital distinction between public and private property rights and how her disregard for this boundary led to her downfall. The chaos of her attempts to enforce a fictitious rule not only harmed her reputation but also damaged relationships she once valued, illustrating the importance of fostering good neighborly ties rather than imposing one's will. The conflict with the Johnson family served as a harsh reminder that strong communities thrive on respect, understanding, and open communication. Karen learned that seeking to control others can lead to unintended consequences. Instead of harmony, her actions bred discord. This realization compelled her to embrace the idea that neighborhoods function best when residents work together and appreciate one another's differences. As Karen set her sights on rebuilding trust within the community, she became committed to engaging with her neighbors positively. Whether it meant attending social events or simply extending a friendly smile, she realized these small gestures could pave the way to meaningful connections. Ultimately, she acknowledged that true harmony arises from collaboration and respect for individual rights, allowing warmth and friendship to flourish instead of conflict and resentment.